You're listening to the Quint's podcast.
What is sedition? Whoever by words or signs or otherwise brings or attempts to bring hatred, contempt, or disaffection towards the government. That's more or less what the Indian Penal Code says about sedition. So imagine their surprise when 49 eminent personalities, including the likes of Mani Ratnam, Anurag Kashyap, Shyam Benegal, and Ramchandra Guha, wrote an open letter to Prime Minister Modi about the rise in lynchings and persecution of minorities and a few other things in India, only to have an FIR slapped against them for sedition. You're listening to The Big Story, the podcast where we dissect headline making news. I'm your host, Vishnu Gopinath. Is dissent seditious? If you disagree with your government, are you automatically committing sedition? That's what we're looking at on this edition of The Big Story. So this actually started in July this year when 49 people wrote to the Prime Minister voicing concern about the state of the country. Their letter said, Jai Shri Ram had been reduced to a provocative war cry. The lynching of Muslims, Dalits and minorities needs to stop immediately. And finally, that there was no democracy without dissent. Here, listen to filmmaker Adur Gopalakrishnan. He was one of the signatories to this letter.
Just because the opinions that we express do not agree with anybody for that matter. Anyone who expresses an opinion that is at variance with the governments does not mean that they are against the nation. And you cannot interpret their statements as derision or something like that. So also another important point that we had mentioned was the crowd killing. The crowd killings of poor people. But will the crowd kill a rich man? Will they kill a man in power? Man who has some strength otherwise in terms of even community. So they choose poor people, and then they attack them and finally ask them to shout Jai Shri Ram.
Forward a month, and a lawyer in Bihar filed a petition against the people who'd written this letter. Sudhir Oja filed the petition and Chief Judicial Magistrate Suryakant Tiwari passed an order, which meant that a case was now filed against the signatories of this letter. Cut to October, and all 49 celebs on the list were suddenly slapped with an FIR. The charges? Sedition, public nuisance, hurting religious feelings, and insulting with an intent to provoke a breach of peace. Just a heads up, the punishment for sedition is life imprisonment, so it's no joke. Now I'm going to ask our legal editor Vakasha Sachdev to join in here and explain why this is such a serious matter. Take it away, Vakasha.
So, sedition is something which, it's got obviously a very strong colonial background to it, right? It was brought in to deal with, by the British government, to kind of deal with anyone who was speaking out against freedom. And think of the people from back then who were charged with sedition: Gandhi, Lala Rajpat Rai, these kind of people. So, Bal Gangadhar Tilak. These were stalwarts of the movement, right? Now, so that gives you an idea of what it was used for, and that itself tells you why it's so dangerous even today, because you're using it to cut out any voices of dissent at a national level. You should see the other sections around it. Like, this is part of a set of sections which deal with things like treason, waging war against the state, all of that. So that sedition is one of those kinds of offences. So it's also treated with a level of severity. So it's not just, the punishment on paper itself is bad, and it's also on paper, it's one of those things which the moment a court sees that charge, it's going to, you're facing a lot more seriousness there. The police also will get more emotive about it. The prosecution is going to get more emotive about it. It's not something which is easy to deal with. And even if you don't get convicted, it's still a bad thing to be, tarred with. Now the thing is this case a fit case for sedition? It's blatantly not. Blatantly. Whether we look at something as simple as, if you look at what's the definition of sedition, right? So section 124A says, whoever by words, spoken or written, signs, visible, repetition, etc. The key to the crux of it, says, brings or attempts to bring into hatred or contempt, or excites or attempts to excite disaffection towards the government established by law in India. So essentially saying that if you're trying to tear down the government in India, and not just say the government of the time, it's about sort of the government established by law. So it's a reference to the entire institution and the idea of government in India. That's what sedition is supposed to be about.
Okay.
In what way is this letter fulfilling even that basic definition? I mean, even the explanation to it clearly says that comments expressing disapprobation of the measures of the government with a view to that alteration by lawful means is not sedition. So if you're giving sound criticism, you're not, out on the streets trying to, create problems, this is not sedition. And you look at the Supreme Court, how they've interpreted it. They've clearly said from the Kedarnath case back in 1962, so it's not as though it's some recent judgment. 1962, we've known that sedition has to deal with incitement to violence or like some sort of violent public disorder. It can't just be me saying, I think the government sucks. That's not sedition. And in fact, here's not even saying the government sucks. This letter was saying there is a problem with the way people are behaving. There's a culture of violence. There's a culture of misuse of, religious slogans. You're not even going against the BJP or the government. And yet it's like, you're ruining the reputation of the country. That's not sedition. And, in 2011, in the Arup Bhuyan case in the Supreme Court, they even sort of clarified it even a bit further. There's still a lot of judgments which had come since 1962 and clearly said it's not even just about inciting violence. I mean, for instance, Karl Marx technically becomes sedition, right? The overthrow of the... but that's even not... It has to be an incitement to imminent violence. So I could say, in 50 years, I would strongly advocate for the working classes to rise up and take over. That's not sedition, because that's talking about... That's said in the future. It's theoretical. It's not... And that's the issue here. You're not dealing with an actual threat to violence. You're not even dealing with things which meet the ingredients of the offense, which is why it was always just a terrible idea.
Great. Thank you so much, Vakasha, for explaining that to our listeners. Now let's, understandably, given what Vakasha just told you, several prominent figures were collectively outraged by this sedition charge being slapped on these celebrities. Here's Congress MP Shashi Tharoor.
There's been mounting concern about the state of freedom of expression in our country. And now the break to say something. No one is accusing the Prime Minister of having filed this case. We know that it was a chief judicial magistrate in a small town in Bihar who gave the order to the police to file the FIR. But the fact that these things are happening is a reflection of a couple of things. The overall atmosphere in the country, which has been deeply, deeply troubling to many of us. I myself have a couple of cases against me for things I've said. And secondly, apart from that, is the persistence of the impression that a lot of the intolerance that is directed at people is either encouraged or at least condoned by the government. Already when it came to things like cow vigilantism and mob lynching, we have consistently said that the Prime Minister's silence is misinterpreted as something that emboldens the people who are attacking others with impunity.
On 8th October, 185 prominent cultural and literary figures slammed the charges and voiced their support for the original letter. Some names on this list include Nasiruddin Shah, Romila Thapar, T.M. Krishna, Anjali Montero, and Irfan Habib. This was what filmmaker and professor at TIS, Anjali Montero, had to say. She is one of the signatories to the second letter.
The case of sedition filed against the 49 individuals who wrote the letter is completely frivolous and unconstitutional. And I don't see how a case like this should have ever been entertained. Because to speak out against lynching is our democratic right as citizens.
And here's the former CEO of Prasar Bharati, Jawahar Sarkar.
No, I mean the entire sequence that went after the incident can be termed in one word as stupid. It was not only overreaction, it was a calculated overreaction in the sense that the government was very clear from day one that as long as this case keeps hanging, there's a sword of Damocles on the heads of people who thought they are dissenting. Now, where this incident is concerned, the solution that appeared so simple, like withdrawal of the case or quashing the FIR, that option was available on day one. I have worked 40 years plus in administration, so I would know that option was open on day one, and that option was exercised by Nitish's government, not the central government, before the central government could sort of turn around and say, oh, the state government's fault, main kya karu?
Next, we have Professor Irfan Habib, who was one of the people who signed the second letter.
That it should not exist in India. And people have said this so many times. But the state, the governments actually find it very useful. And so they are not very keen to do away with it. Because it's a law which punished Bal Gangadhar Tilak. It punished Mahatma Gandhi. So it was used by the colonial government against our own nationalist leaders. So today, the independent governments are using that against their own citizens. So something which is absolutely not required in this country. So when something like this happens, one really feels concerned. Where are we going? Because this is not part of any democratic governance. Because such laws cannot exist in a country which is a democracy.
Ironically, the second letter, which supports the first letter and voices similar concern about persecution and incidents of lynchings, came on the same day that RSS chief Mohan Bhagwat, while addressing the Sangh at their annual day event, said that lynchings are a concept native to the East, brought to India by quote-unquote foreign religions. After the second letter, all charges against the signatories were dropped. Police said that the man who filed the letter, Sudhir Ojha, couldn't produce any evidence to back his petition, and they added that they will be booking him for filing a false case. Ojha is alleged to have connections with NDA ally Ramvilas Paswan's Lok Janshakti party, which didn't look too good for the government. Speaking for the government, Bihar Deputy Chief Minister Sushil Modi called Ojha a quote-unquote serial litigant who has filed cases against several prominent people in the past, including the likes of Manmohan Singh, Amitabh Bachchan and Hrithik Roshan, quote-unquote, for publicity. Now Bihar police said they have booked Ojha for the false petition and that he'll now face the long arm of the law. If you like this podcast and want to hear more like it, subscribe to the Quint's podcast channel on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, JioSavanRadio.com, Deezer, Castbox, Stitcher, or any of the other podcast platforms that are there right now. And that's all we have for you on this edition of The Big Story. Join us again tomorrow for another edition of The Big Story podcast.
Thanks for listening. Log on to the Quint's website and check out our other podcasts